Waiting until people connect. Okay, let's start. So welcome everyone to our fourth iGGi seminar. This seminar is focused on procedural audio and narrative game design. We have 4 participants, 4 panelists on this seminar, and I shall start introducing them one by one. Sorry, maybe first, my name is Susanne. I'm the manager of iGGi Center for Doctoral Training. So I'm going to moderate today's panel. Let's start with the first participant. That's Alessandro Coronas. Have I pronounced that correctly, Alessandro?
Sì, va bene. It's good.
Oh, va bene, okay.
Sehr gut.
Cool. Sehr gut, thank you. Okay,
so yeah.
you just want to introduce yourself a little.
Yes, so I'm Alessandro, and then, like, in a nutshell, I've been working on this game for like 8 years, which is really unusual for a game, but we extensively explored and twisted and experimented with procedural audio so much that at the end that we had to strip down everything. But so that's what I've been doing with procedural audio for the past 8 years. And yeah, and I work in the game industry since 2009 kind of ish, and yeah, and that's it.
So you say the game that you're developing took 8 years. It's a work in progress kind of thing, or?
No, it's been released in 2019.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And that game is Mutazione.
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Thank you.
Sorry, I didn't mention that.
That's okay. We can as well do some advertising. Paul is next up. Paul Weir.
Hi there. So I'm a composer, sound director, voice director, kind of anything to do with audio, mostly in games. Probably about 70% of my work is in games. I've worked in generative music for about 20 years. And usually building and designing my own systems for games, as well as kind of retail spaces. So we've done a lot of work like shopping centers and banks having real-time generative music. I think I'm probably I guess if I'm known for anything, it's probably the game No Man's Sky, where that's a procedurally generated space adventure game. We built a lot of our own kind of procedural audio tools and music tools for that. But I've worked on probably 50 or 60 games on all kind of platforms. I've been knocking around for ages, really.
Yeah, that's very interesting. So you have a lot of breadth in terms of games. So I suppose every game works differently in terms of audio. So that's really useful for this panel, I think, as well. Yeah. And Alessandro's take is then more sort of in-depth, I think, sure. Probably. Okay, so then next we have our 2 iGGi PhD researchers. That's Kyle and Timea. I'll start with Kyle.
Hi everyone. So I'm Kyle, and I'm researching and designing music generation systems for the Unreal Engine that use machine learning and neural networks to recreate human expressivity. And I also did a master's thesis on music generation in video games, and that's kind of my background.
Mm-hmm. Cool. And then next, Timea Farkas.
Hi. I also have a background in music performance, mainly classical music performance and music composition. And first, I was mainly interested in the relationship between music world building and narrative. But lately, I am gravitating towards more and more game design tasks. So I'm probably the least technical in terms of procedural audio in the group, but hopefully I can ask some meaningful questions.
Yep. So Timea sort of also inspired this panel, even though she says, I'm sure that's an understatement, that you're the least technical, but maybe would you like to introduce the topic a little bit so that we frame what we are aiming at discussing today?
Yes, so today we are talking about procedural audio in narrative game design. And I am particularly interested in the differences between traditional music composition and procedural audio when it comes to the world building possibilities of music in a game, and how you make sure that the significant narrative points of the game align with the significant points of the music in a game. That's pretty much it. Kyle, do you want to add anything? Maybe.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's got interesting implications as well, doesn't it? Because we kind of got into this before everyone got in, but technically all things in games are procedural because games are procedures based, but procedural audio as a term has its own meaning. And I think there's like clearing up around that area that we could probably do for the audience.
Yes, Kyle, good point. So I think I will, because I had a pre-discussion with Paul before, who was quite specific about his definition of procedural audio. So maybe Paul, if you want to take over from here so that we establish the definition of the terms that we're
my definition
as tools for discussion.
Yeah. It's probably because I've got my own opinions and probably completely different to everyone else's. So, you know, all I'll say is in complete arrogance is, you know, having done it lots of times, therefore I have to be right. So that's the way it works, isn't it? And also it feels like I'm really interested in what you think procedural audio is, like everyone else. And are we talking about procedural audio in terms of sound design and music, or does it not matter? Where does generative music fit in? Is it generative music or is it procedural? Like they're all technical terms, and in a way it doesn't really matter. I think from my direction, the way I've viewed it, like I 100% can be wrong about this, is on the one side we've got generative music, which for me is kind of essentially a clever randomized system. Okay, so it wouldn't be AI necessarily. It could have AI elements. It's not necessarily generating anything new. It's rearranging. It's coming up with stuff dynamically, you know, with game rules, and you know that's something that kind of on my side I've done loads of times. So essentially, you know, the composer is composing. The playback system is a live playback system which is rules based. Okay, then at the other end, I would say for me, procedural audio is real-time content generation. You know, it's again rules-based. An example, and that just makes me cringe having to use my own work, but it's just a good example, is like in the game No Man's Sky, we've got alien creatures, and they can be all kind of different types and different sizes. So to solve that problem, we created like a physically modeled vocal tract. That's kind of, you know, a useful example, because then we could use the data from the game to drive what the actual sound was sounding like, essentially. You know, so we create a physical model with lots of inputs. And for me, that's where procedural audio is kind of focused. And my view is different from, say, someone like Andy Farnell, who's got his own opinion. Because for me, it can't be all audio in games is procedural. That makes no sense. Like, otherwise, it's just game audio, right? There has to be something special, which is why we're calling it procedural audio. And for me, that's something where it is created in real time. It's got deep links into the game, and there's this kind of interrelationship between the game and the sound that pings back and forth. So it's much more dynamic than, say, traditional audio playback. Okay, so that's my starting pitch to everyone else.
Okay, maybe Alessandro can chip in here and voice his take on this.
Yeah, it's fantastico, because I think for me, it's the opposite. Bellissimo. Like, and I always felt like when Paul, when you said like, this is my own take, because this is how I've been approaching this. it made me think, because this past year we've been working on that. We called it procedural music, but I didn't really bother to just say, no, is this like the correct term? It actually made sense because there was like procedures, there were like rules in the algorithm. And for me, generative music has always been like Bloom from Brian Eno, I think it's Bloom it's called, where you have actual oscillators in the app that generate sound. And that's why I connected the word generative music, because he was actually generating content on the fly. While procedural one, it's always been like the music composer generating content and then chopped it into a lot of pieces, fed those pieces into the algorithm, design it, and then it would just rearrange it, based on whatever rule you made, including the myriads of happy accidents that usually happen. So that's really interesting, that the way, it just really, I'm going to think about that in the following days, I'm pretty sure. But yeah, for me, it's just overall, I just perceived it like differently, just really starting from the meaning of the word, like generative music generates music like within this ecosystem. Procedural music, kind of a more like it's a way to rearrange music that it's already been done somewhere else, and then is now inhabits this algorithm. If that makes sense.
Yeah. And by the way, like I'm not stuck on it. You can use whatever terms you want interchangeably. Like there is no set definition. It's not, and actually, is really obviously, is like the great example. Because the term generative music comes from Eno. He did invent the term as well as the concept.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah, and that was way back when he was introduced to some software called Koan by Seo at the time. Now it's called Notical, or the Notical is different, but it's evolved from Koan. And he was invited to create an album on a floppy disk at the time. And that's what he did. And that was so Koan was the first generative music application. It's well worth checking out. We used it years and years ago. And that was rule-based, really heavily rule-based. You define scales and probabilities, but it didn't initially have a synthesizer. It just used general MIDI. So it's kind of like a MIDI phrase generator, essentially.
Yeah.
So Bloom has kind of evolved out of his work like 20 years before that. So there's an interesting history to it. And as I said, the terms are interchangeable. Really, I'm not stuck on them.
Is it? Because for me, yeah. Cool, yeah. It's pretty interesting.
Okay, so just to summarize, so we're going to discuss whatever term we use, the audio that Paul described where, audio is basically has deep links into the game and somehow feeds the game. Well, that's maybe also an interesting aspect. Could the game feed off the audio? But that's maybe another panel to discuss. I take it one by one. So the format usually is that we have panelists asking each other questions. So maybe I should start with our researchers. Kyle, would you like to ask a question to the panel?
Yeah, I'll just find the document. It's on a different screen. Sorry, it's been a moment.
Or whoever, maybe one of you has a question already. Alessandro, do you have a question on your lips?
No, really.
No.
Just not for now. I'm really curious to see what will come up. That's gonna be interesting.
All right, Timea. Oh no, yeah, Kyle.
Yeah.
Kyle is ready now.
I have a question for Alessandro, if that's okay. This is something I've been curious about for a while, and actually I haven't asked you this before, but I was wondering that in Mutazione, it's a game where you restore these magical gardens, which is really, really cool. But the game has this mechanic when you work on the gardens, and it also has parts where you just talk to people and then play the narrative parts of the game. So I've always been wondering, is all of the music procedural in Mutazione, or is the gardens procedural, but the other music, for example, when the band plays, there is a band in the game, is that also procedural?
No. There's like several levels of procedurality. The gardens, everything started with the gardens, so that's the most complex algorithm. Then, when you get into the wilderness, that is also strictly based on we basically made like these sub algorithms that were much more simple and the Wilderness is probably the most procedural one. The town music is procedural, but that's what we had to strip down and oversimplify in the last 6 months of development, because it was really a nightmare to test. So that's also procedural, and the band music is linear, just linear music, and yeah.
So how do you, when you have a project, and I'm asking this because I don't know a lot about procedural music, but I'm guessing some people in the audience would also be in similar position. So when you have parts of the game as procedural audio and procedural music, and other parts would be linear, how do you mix these so that you get a coherent sound world within the game?
Oh, I don't know. It's like very straightforward. Like you just thinking about it. For instance, when you go back to the Wilderness, I'm sorry for everyone that have not played the game, but there's like an area in the game where you have this music which is heavily procedural. There's no BPMs involved, which is one of the very big important thing when you write procedural music, at least for me, because when you have BPMs, things get much more tricky to make it flow. When it's like freeform, like the Gardens, it's much easier to just nail, like, you know. And so there's a part where you call the Wilderness where you have freeform procedural music, and then we switch back to the village, and that is the town music, which is BPM based, kind of procedural-ish. It's a really big hybrid between linear and procedural, and it just really happens like naturally. I never really bumped into any situation where I felt damn, like we need something special to just make them flow together or like transition together. It was like really straightforward.
I could actually just briefly pick up, seeing as a moment of silence, but so that's an interesting issue with, however we're going to call it, with kind of real-time generation of music, in terms of BPM and tempo and things like that. So in a way, the easiest way of making music, not to kind of denigrate it, is kind of gentle ambient music, you know, where it isn't BPM led, and that, you know, that kind of works really nicely. And again, with classic Eno, like, you know, his stuff fits beautifully. You know, and there's a reason why his classic ambient albums sound like the way they do, because he encouraged that process in his work process, you know, that random process. And we did loads of it, like on the shops and things like that, and banks, just gentle ambient music that can respond to interaction. It does become more problematic when it's like more of a defined genre. But it's not impossible, like, especially in games, sometimes you're working against technical limitations, like you've got to have a clock rate, which is really accurate. So if you've got drum loops going and you want to synchronize all your instruments, like it has to be perfect, whatever the frame rate is doing, you know, so you have to work with that, and that can be tricky. You know, but it's 100% possible. You just need to add extra systems, you know, it just becomes another layer on top of it. And also, you always need to approach the composition process with that in mind from the beginning. You know, and sometimes on some games, people like get sent a bunch of tracks or stems and they're like, make that generative. And you're like, well, you kind of can't. You can dynamically mix it, but it's always going to be fixed. Like, it's really hard after the fact to do it.
Yeah. Paul, can I ask you a question? Like, I would like to see if the biggest struggle was the same as mine, but I won't tell you mine. I won't spoil the surprise. I want to say the match. Like, what was the trickiest part, like, when you were like composing procedural music, but you were like locked to a BPM? What was the trickiest part for you? Because for me, that was one very specific thing.
It was okay. So I think the most difficult aspect is you want to force change into the system. So it always sounds a bit different, because, you know, the challenge, as I'm sure you found, is you build all these rules. And actually, this is a complete parallel with game design as well. We'll come to that. So you listen to the music and you come back to it 5 minutes later. And yes, technically it's different, but essentially it sounds the same. it's the same feeling, it's kind of the same thing. And game players don't necessarily think it's that different. So we had this challenge early on No Man's Sky where, every planet essentially is different. The algorithm creates an infinite number of planets, fine. But if your sky is, let's say, orange on one planet and a slightly different shade of red on another, you don't pick up on that. It's just all kind of the same kind of colors. So you end up limiting the randomness in order for it to be much more noticeable. So you kind of just fence it in and then force change into the system. So yes, it could just tick away creating music as it likes. But we kept putting rules in to go, okay, if you've done that for a certain number of minutes, force a change into it, make it different. Otherwise, it kind of never feels different, even if technically it's different.
Mm-hmm.
That's probably not the answer to your question.
But I mean, and all this music that you're referring to, was BPM based.
Yeah.
To have beats and the structure. No, but specifically for the BPM based with an actual structure to it.
Yeah. Well, our structure was based on players. So most of BPM music, not all of it, most of it is say an action sequence. So we'd go into essentially fight music, which would change the feel of music and bring in all the BPM elements.
Right.
But we have a kind of map where the intensity of a fight with whatever rules we use changes. It doesn't change the mix. It changes what sounds are applicable in that piece of music, all BPM locked.
Mm-hmm.
And we know that it's not going to stay in the highest state for very long. It never does. It just can't. So it's going to drop down again. So we're relying on the game dynamics to force the structure of music.
Okay.
Now, we do want to know what your biggest challenge was.
So the biggest challenge, and that's, by the way, the reason why we had to strip it down drastically towards the end. By the way, now the system it's really simple. So you get an idea. It's based on sections. You imagine you have a song that has potentially 3 sections. I rendered these 3 sections into 3 chunks, and now the algorithm says play 1, 2, 3 first. So we establish the melody and you understand the piece of music, and then you can go procedural. You can use section 3, then 1, then 2, then 3, then 2, then 1, and it goes on and on like this. And that's the hyper simple version of it. And basically my biggest challenge was when there was BPMs involved. So they had the rhythm and there was a structure. And by the way, Paul, we wanted to have an actual, not really some abstract drony music, even though there was BPMs, but an actual song. And that's probably also why it became quite hard at the end. And it was just to make it flow like a proper song, but still being procedural. Because with an algorithm is based on, it's a binary code, it's true, false, 0, 1, black, white, it's just one thing. But when us as human beings we're extremely fluid, as well as nature, and so as well as a song that's really fluid. Usually there's transitions, you think about dance music, there's and then big white noise thing, and then you just go into the other part of the song. And usually in that big white noise ramp up, there's also a tail that connects them. There's all these subtleties that you know them when you compose that you really need to take care of. And I remember we had to create these subcategories in the algorithm. So we had the song, we had the beat, we had the chords, we had the bass. But then I came up with these subcategories I call them juice and transitions, for instance. And that helped a lot by just making it flow. And transition is quite easy. It's probably what was a little cymbal roll. It was really basic elements. And juice is more some random sounds that would just play on top. They could play anywhere at any time, with just maybe that's it, which sounds absolutely meaningless now. But if you just put them into the flow of a song, there's how can I explain this? I don't know if that makes sense. This juice, but usually I write very detailed music. There's always a lot of instruments that do small things, maybe just in one part of the song, and they just don't play it ever again. So that what I had to create all these juice transitions. There was like 2 more, I guess, but it was all based on just recreating this flow that you would naturally perceive in music, but with procedural one, when you're dealing with these blocks, these rules, this binary code, then you have to recreate that and create finer gradients so that it's not summer, winter, but that's also fall and springtime and winter. Yeah, that was definitely my biggest challenge. And testing, of course, was just like a nightmare.
So we're meant to discuss procedural audio and narrative design, which reminds me that we haven't really defined narrative design and should maybe look at that a little bit as well. I don't know, Timea, do you want to just frame that term for us as well so that we could then connect the two?
I don't know if it needs to be defined necessarily. I think it's just games which have a significant amount of narrative. I've been actually wondering, this is a very yes or no question, so it's not going to be too interesting, but I've been wondering, Paul, if the Last Campfire also has generative music, because that game has a lot of narrative, and I've been wondering, because I tried to Google it, but I didn't find the answer to this.
Oh, that is such a good question, and you're the only person to ask that question. I'm very pleased you did. That's so nice of you, and it does. But we never said it did. Mm-hmm. Because there's no point, there's no reason. So Last Campfire is, if you've played it, brilliant. For everyone else, it's a very, very linear, narrative-driven short game. It's about 4 hours. Really, really hand-authored. Everything's hand-authored. Like a very simple, straightforward puzzle game, really. It's quite a sweet game. So most of the game, so the system we had is I can identify every room, which is every map. So for sake of everyone else, like you're in a forest or you're in a cave. Fine, and that just comes up. We built it in Unity, it comes up as a list, fine. I can attach a piece of music to that room, no problem at all, it just loops. But also what I can do is attach ambiances. But on top of that, we built a very simple generative music system. So for spaces that were larger or were like, we're a small team, haven't got much time, we've got to finish the game, like it was kind of easier, more convenient to write like randomized music sections. So then it was really just like a whole load of like little phrases. So again, like Alessandro was saying, like bass and chord and melody, and just probability values attached to them. There's no interaction, doesn't care what the game's doing. The one quite nice thing is you can run it over subsequent rooms. So as you go from one space to another space, you can introduce instruments to it. Or if an existing instrument still playing, it'll just go, fine, I'm just going to carry on playing that. So I think it segues quite nicely. Like you don't really notice it's going from linear loop into like generative and back out again. So yes, well done. Yeah, it did, and it was a really helpful solution to that problem. And I keep it in, I've done quite a few talks, and I keep coming back to this issue in games. It's like, if you're going to convince the game studio to do anything procedural or generative, it has to be a solution to a problem, usually, especially on a bigger title where there's lots of money involved and risk averse, and every time if you sell it as it's going to save money and it's going to produce a better game, that's a win-win situation. That's a great way to get into it. Thank you.
I was actually curious about that, especially because the Last Campfire has quite touching story parts, and usually when it comes to the music, you want to signify that. So how do you make sure that the right music plays at the right time? I think that's my biggest mystery about procedural music, is that when in movies you make the type of music that sort of makes people cry when they need to. So how can you do that with procedural audio as well?
I don't want to monopolize the discussion, so you should chime in. But from my side, I have to say my experience, like I haven't done that. I've always gone to a linear piece of music, and that's it's really nice to move from generative to linear. Mm-hmm. And you know, if you don't want to think of it in those terms, it's just like, it's almost like the distance from a player, like how upfront is the music? And that's, you know, we did that not in a very clever or unformed way in Campfire. We do it a little bit in No Man's Sky, like pushing it forward, pulling it back. You know, it's not sophisticated, but kind of creatively, it's interesting to think about that. How much attention is the music getting? And on kind of a slightly related note, like at the end of that game, which I won't spoil, but you know, it's quite a nice end sequence, and it kind of resolves the storyline. Sean Murray, the producer, wanted to license some music, which we've done quite a lot. And it was going to be a great piece of music. It was lovely and it would have worked. But I didn't want that. And I actually fought against that quite strongly, because with a very linear game, you've got a chance to be very thematic about it, even if you're being generative. And I really wanted to kind of resolve all those themes and bring it all back at the end, you know, because it kind of felt like the story comes around and concludes, and I wanted to do that musically. So, you know, I got my way and told him where to go. But, you know, that's all part of like kind of the game music process. And that feeds into what you're saying about narrative as well. You know, for me, because I work a lot with writers and directors, you know, narrative is supremely important, and everything I do tries to support the narrative. You know, and that goes along with voice directing as well. You know, it has to be driven by that. And it's outside the scope of this discussion, but actually like mixing narrative heavy games is a challenge, you know, because you're always supporting the narrative and trying to push that. As a sound design, everything else has to be, you know, in support of that. But with Campfire, you know, we've got one voice for narrator. She's always mixed on top of everything. You know, and again, that's a whole separate discussion, like with the narrator, how that works in that particular game, and where that narrative comes from. That's quite an interesting discussion, but outside the scope of this.
Yeah, so I have 3 questions on my lips there. One, just because Paul said saving money and so on, that reminded me of one of Kyle's questions that I discussed with you regarding AAA games. Do you maybe want to ask that question, Kyle?
Yeah. So a lot of my research actually entails like looking at how people create with, and like currently looking at, there's like kind of a lack of usage. So the formal question would be, it's not really seen a large uptick in the use of procedural music in games, especially if we were to muddy the waters of terminology for a second. There's a Worrall et al. Paper that states like generative would be something that increases the data footprint, whereas like transformational would be the kind of generative systems we've been discussing, where it's recombining musical elements and samples and layers. But I wondered if anyone had any thoughts as to why procedural music systems and procedural audio haven't seen more of a rise in usage in AAA games.
I think probably Paul, who had the original comment, would be the best to answer this one.
You've heard too much from me. I've spoken way too much.
Just a short answer, maybe.
Okay, very short answer. I think there's a lack of skills. I think there's a lack of ability to sell the idea in a way that makes commercial sense. There's a lack of tools. And also, like, what we have works. Like, you know, so it's very hard to dissuade, you know, a publisher or developer to a completely different system. We were super lucky in No Man's Sky because that was a perfect, you know, opportunity to do it. And before that, I left a game called Thief, and we built our own music system on Thief, which then wasn't used after I left. And that was a perfect example where it just wasn't skill based. So I think it's turning that ship, you know, is slow and difficult. But I think there's a mindset to do it. I think there's a willingness to do it.
Oh, that's good to hear, at least, as someone trying to make accessible tools in that area. But just to
I've got an awesome tool, by the way. We built for clients a really, really lovely Unity-based standalone generative music system that hasn't really seen the light of day. I need to find out what's happening to it. But it's really cool. So it's really cool. It's like it got all the DSPs in there. It's got some like granular synthesis in there, and loads of inputs. So you can take like any old input and assign it to any of the music logic system, and it's all like, and it works on Linux and all this lot. It's really, really nice.
Very cool.
So you know, because it's a client owns it, I can't really license it, but it'd be great to push it out, because I think that's a perfect, simple tool for people to use.
Yeah. Sorry, a quick follow-on question for that. And this sort of follows on from an earlier discussion. Does that tool have like an integrated system for handling the difference between sample rate and frames per second? Like, if you built is there like a subsystem handling that? Because I find Unreal Engine has the Quartz system, which is like its own way of handling that. And then in Unity, I haven't really seen a packaged system that does that.
I will give a quickest answer, because frankly, I can't have it on all the time.
Yeah.
What you say is a fundamental problem. It's really hard. We dealt with it in No Man's Sky because it's our own engine.
Yeah.
So we have an audio thread that's independent, unless the game completely plummets. I remember in Thief, which was Unreal probably 3, that was a major issue, like just getting stable clock. Stable clocks are a problem in games, like for sure. And you have to do some hard work. In the standalone system, it is super stable, but we did a lot of work on maintaining clocks.
That makes sense.
So, yeah, Kyle?
I was going to say, has anyone else got any questions? I've got more, but should probably give other people a chance to ask.
Audience, you can drop questions in the chat, by the way. So the two others that were on my lips before was Alessandro, what he said about the difficulty to make it flow. So obviously that's particularly important for narrative design, audio for narrative design. So I take it from Paul's comments that maybe one solution is to blend linear audio with procedural audio to sort of catch the uncertainties in between. But are there any strategies or anything that sort of would support the flow of the narrative in particular ways? That's to Alessandro.
I would say that like there was a moment in the development where I just hit my face on a wall, because there's like a moment in the later stages where it was like really important, like emotionally. And so we had a meeting, we were discussing the moment. I said, like, okay, guys, I'll just write, like, I'll go linear for now, and we'll have like, I'll be controlling the emotional ramp up of the music. And they said, no, it's not possible. And I was like, how am I supposed to do that? Because it was like we needed to control, like the player could control like the timing, the pace was in the hands of the player. And this was like a huge problem, because we needed to build up, but the player technically could have gone like from one sentence, then wait 13 years and then go to the other one. So we have to wait for 13 years. That was possible, And I remember I finished that meeting and I had like a huge question mark above my head, like, how am I going to tackle that? And it was like a hybrid between like linear and the procedural part was like, it was supposed to be, say, elastic enough for the player to trigger that. But at the same time, ramping up, I really have no idea if it makes sense for anything that I'm saying, because I have it in my head. But basically, it was like a really weird hybrid between linear and procedural music that got me out of that. And so, yeah, I don't know. Like, is it enough as an answer? I don't think so. But basically, like, I'll tell you, I've tried to explain that very briefly. Like, so imagine that we had these scenes, and every scene was like a ramp up emotionally. So it was heavily based on narrative. But these scenes were like triggered by the player. So, but we needed to build up. So like, basically there was like a sound for every scene that had the longest tail in the universe. Like it was really long. It was like probably 3 minutes long, because hopefully the player will be, fast enough to go. And so basically this ramp up was basically created by this long tail staking up, and eventually just burst into this final one, which was like procedurally like triggered. It was like a really weird hack that I had to come up with. I don't know if that answers that, but yeah, that's the best I could do for now. Yeah.
Could the visual and narrative end of the design do something to support or facilitate this in a better way? So when you say it's triggered by the player, if there were like intersections where sort of audio had a chance to predict a little bit what the next step would be, would that be help, and how can, I suppose, audio and visual and other aspects of the design work hand in hand, especially in view of narrative design?
Yeah, and the problem was that the architecture of the game was built years before, and there was no time to change that. And so I also proposed, like, can we have a video of this sequence rendered in a video with the same resolution and stuff, so that I could just, no, it's not possible. So it was just based on these kind of postcards that you would just look at it, then press a button, go to the other postcard, and then go to that postcard. That was the architecture, and that was the main culprit bottleneck, because we couldn't really go past that. And so when Paul was talking about like the fact that you need to build tools to support procedural music, it reminded me of that. I said, I wish we had one, but really there was absolutely no time, because the architecture of the game, because that was a gameplay moment, wasn't supporting procedural audio as you would do in the Gardens, for instance. That was ready, but we couldn't also transfer that to that. So yeah.
We feel that audio in games is often a bit of an afterthought.
Yes. What Paul said before, like there's a lack of skill. I totally agree. But if we backtrack a little bit, it's just because audio is still it's still underrated. Like people, like even big professionals, and I worked with some big clients as well as a freelancing, that really they're not aware of the massive magnitude of audio in your life, not just in a game. Like if you would look at a Picasso picture for 2 days, pretty much you will be bored. If I let you listen to a loop of 13 seconds for 2 days straight, you probably go nuts. And also we found that in Unity, afterthought, like we had to do a lot of dirty hacks in order to accommodate this probably like 400 channels mixer. Because you could totally see that in Unity, the audio was like, oh, right, we have to do audio as well, and audio tools. I don't know if it got better now, because we used like 2019 versions, but Paul, please make some new tools, and Kyle as well, please. We're waiting for you. But it's also a matter of education, I think. I think Paul is right, and I'm pretty sure like he's been pushing this a lot. Like, and in a way, I think Mutazione will also like raise the threshold a little bit of what you can do with procedural audio, and the importance of procedural audio as well, especially in a non-linear environment like a game.
Paul, no pressure. Yes,
just a really quick one. So I was wondering that if we could have Carl's question to Alessandro, but with indies, because I think we had a chat before, and you mentioned to me, Alessandro, that every time you start a new game project, you always suggest procedural music for the project. So how do you pitch it? Because I think you've also worked with indies quite a lot, as well as maybe bigger clients, but I think indies also worry about money quite a lot. So what is your pitch for them when it comes to procedural music?
Yeah, I mean, the fact that we've been exploring procedural audio for like 8 years, really, I would say like 5 years straight, full time, all year round. Because then the other time is probably me composing linear music. So we really dug very deeply into that rabbit hole, which means that we bumped into a lot of dead ends, but I would collect like, things that we could do basically I got the tools to recreate very simple procedural algorithms, very, very simple. So like a lot of very, I think that if someone is into programming, like it's really easy to program these algorithms. Like it's really, and it's not rocket science really. Just that I think I agree with Paul. Like it's just because procedural audio is still like a bit of a juvenile, fancy thing to do, but for the most part, like fun. But yeah, it's really easy. That's why I always pitch like maybe just we use a beat and then we just interchange like a couple of tracks, or like usually it's about like dividing the song into as many tracks as you want, and the less the track, the easier the algorithm is. And then, yeah, just compose in a way, because as Paul said, like you have to, for me, it's like a 50-50 love affair. Like you compose, you do whatever you want as a composer, but then sometimes you have to compose for the algorithm. And it's like, you can do whatever you want, you make a rule for it, it works, but sometimes a rule dictates how you should compose. And so, yeah, it's pretty simple. Like, that's why I always pitch them, because they don't know. Like it could be that simple. Procedural is like a bit of a overwhelming thing, but in fact, it's not rocket science. It's just like really that simple. I mean, yeah.
Sorry, I just realized I missed two questions in the chat. Mike, do you want to ask the one in person, or should I read it out? You're listening. Mike Seiger. Okay, I'll just read it out. So he writes, do you think procedural music generation tools in future will be easily accessible to educators or facilitators to enable co-creativity of learning goals or game development?
There's a quick sound design thing, not music, but I know Richard Stevens and Dave Raybould have done some videos for Epic where they teach some procedural sound design in an accessible way, like a video course. But for music, I don't know if there's much. I suppose Paul and Alessandro would be the people to ask if there's any resources like that.
Well, I would say a good place to start. By the way, Richard's great. I know Richard well. He's a lovely chap.
Yeah.
I would say like WIs like gives you a lot of the tools. It's there, it's free to use. There's a really nice task that sometimes I set students where we define the rules of a piece of music, like really simple, like here's the BPM, here's the key. Now everyone just go off and make some sounds based on that. But independently, stick it in WIs, randomize the values, and then bring everything together. And you get some really lovely results, and you can attach controllers to it if you want. But I would say that's a great place to start. It's all there. It works. It's not hard to do. You can take any of their game demos and insert your own kind of random music. So I'd say that. And if you're looking at game audio in general anyway, then just bloody well learn WIs, because that's like as much of a standard as there is in the industry.
And if I can add something, it's also related to what you, Paul, said before. It's like, it's really a paradigm shift in your mindset that these things exist. You got wires, which is, the tool that gives you a lot of opportunities to do that. But also as a composer, you should have a mindset that you can now think about a piece and then already start to decompose that and divide that and fed that into the algorithm. It's, totally agree. It's all there. But more tools will be cool. Right, Kyle? I know you're searching on that. We're waiting for you.
Yeah. I mean, my own research is because we've kind of hit a point earlier where you were discussing knowing when to transition between linear and procedural music in order to support narrative, because obviously procedural music systems have a greater variation, so you're going to get less listener fatigue in players, but then in story beats is not necessarily always appropriate. but then sometimes it is. I'm currently trying to figure out a way to do procedural melody generation over the top of static linear background music as a tool, for an example, because I think that the ability to change individual layers has interesting implications on how it will affect like following the narrative, but also offering more variation. But I guess there's not really much of a question there. It's just an idea for a tool. But
I've got a question for you. Like, great melody generator. How do you? Have you ever? I'm pretty sure you did, because it was mentioned that in the. Well, let me just read. Because it was because with these. Yeah, enhancing the musical and expressive qualities of MIDI composition. How do you do that? Because I'm really curious about that. Because MIDI, again, binary, on off. You can modulate stuff, but yeah, I'm all ears.
Yeah, I'm wary of how much I can say because I'm trying to get a paper into Izmir this year. But there's a field of expressive rendering research where people train algorithms, either regression algorithms or neural nets, and you synchronize performance data and quantized MIDI data, and then you teach the algorithm to understand the difference and then to apply the difference to quantized MIDI in real time.
Right.
Which is what I've been trying to do in Game Engine. So, and obviously MIDI sound quality is not very good. I don't know if there's a more diplomatic way to say that. Like, people don't play games nowadays and expect to hear MIDI. But using MIDI to trigger samples in real time, which you're applying like a variety of dynamics and micro timing deviations to, is how I'm trying to create like a human level of expression in real time, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And especially tempo is a thing, because musicians have good tempo in their head, they think. But when you take like a performance in audio and you try to map it to quantized MIDI, it doesn't always start and end the same time as it should, because tempo is like a global thing that changes over time, isn't it? And trying to model how people do that is another part of trying to make a tool that can help people make expressive MIDI, I guess.
Right.
I don't know if that's interesting or not, but
yeah, but can I also add two things? One thing I've always missed from basically sample players like Contact. I'm amazed that they didn't think about that over the course of the development. The Contact has been around for like quite a while now, which is the change, which is one of the most frequent things when you play a real instrument, like is the change of the timbre. Basically gets darker or brighter depending on what you do.
Yeah.
And I'm amazed that in Contact there's no like a randomized feature that can randomize this kind of, and it's basically like a really gentle EQ shaping, like as a low pass filter.
Yeah.
Usually it's more like bright and dark. It's not really like a lack of bottom end or like being a bit beefier. It's just really that. And also like pitch wobbling as well, but not in micro sense, which is another thing that no sample player have, because that's what their job. They want to play sample, make it as musical as possible. But again, I think they invested so much in multi-timbral stuff, but they completely forgot with these two things. And I think they could get so much more results by adding these two small algorithms that would just occasionally just change the timbre and the pitch. Just do it. I mean, go and pitch that to the native instruments. I don't know. But by the way, what do you think about that? And also, Paul, I would be really curious to know what you think about that.
Well, I think we've touched upon like the key issue, and I think actually you can do that in Contact with their scripting language. I think so.
But
I think their scripting language now is so powerful. I think you can do that. It's worth a look anyway. Mm-hmm. So I think expressiveness is really, really like the key word in all this. And And that kind of also touches on Florence's question as well, which we haven't asked about encountering glitches in procedural audio. Because like Alessandro, as you said, you can build systems which are actually not that intelligent, like kind of does some random stuff. It moves things around a little bit, it changes a bit based on what the game's doing. And that's fine, but it's a world of difference between actually kind of creating new stuff that seems to be kind of much more fluid and dynamic and expressing itself. And that's where I think machine learning is really interesting in that field. Not in music, but like one of the issues we had when creating this vocal tract is on our first pass, what we kind of tend to forget about is what is triggering the sound, like what brain is triggering it in the game. So we created a synthesizer essentially, and we could play it, but even though the model was okay, it sounded very mechanical because it wasn't expressing itself, So fine, we could play a note on and we could shuffle values around, but it never quite sounded right. So then we moved to using Perlin noise, which is kind of a standard noise generation algorithm, nice and bumpy. And that still doesn't sound right because our brains are picking up on these kind of regular patterns and it didn't sound believable. And the thing that changed it was we ended up building quite a nice custom-made software MIDI control system where like all the values were laid out. We had like 30 different MIDI CC values laid out. I did it on an iPad and then I performed it. So I used like the gyroscope and I did like multi-layer performance of all these. That sounded believable. Then we took that data and kind of jiggled all the values. And so it's never what I performed, but it was a version of what I performed. And that really worked. Now we had to do that because there wasn't any other method, but that's where I think machine learning would be invaluable. Would be like, take some examples of what I've done, or I kind of want it a bit like this. Now just generate all this stuff for me, that then tricks the brain into thinking it's being performed, but kind of you've done the hard work in setting it all up, but the human performance element has come from the machine learning. Maybe Kyle's got
good
that.
answer. And thanks also for picking up on Florence's question. Maybe we can expand on that question a little bit, although I still have the third question that I had in my head, if people aren't bored already. So encountered any interesting glitches in procedural audio? Alessandro?
Yeah.
Have you?
Yeah, but more like glitches is like, I came up with a whole bunch of rules. Sorry?
Things that didn't work. No, sorry.
No, I think actually it's the engine like was combining things in a way that I'd never thought about, because usually I would just prepare everything, render everything, fed them into the engine, reload all the clips, and then press play. And usually it would start with something, what was that? I never really thought about that. And so through those, like, no, I wouldn't call them glitches, but happy accidents, I actually came up with new rules that became an integral part of the algorithm. Just the new rules that basically were instructed to me by the algorithm, basically combining things in a way that, yeah. It could have been glitches as well, but you never really screwed up like just playing, things randomly. But yeah, it was really inspiring in a way also. In my experience.
It maybe ties in a little bit with the previous comment on expression, but if we have glitches, would that make it sound more, not human? Obviously, we realize it's auto-generated maybe, but could glitches actually be used in that sense to improve expression?
Mm-hmm.
Go on.
Yeah, so no, go, Kyle.
Oh, sorry, I was going to say, I've been conducting an investigation where I interview composers about, workflow, and looking at how workflow is. People try and recreate workflow in procedural music systems and, other generative systems. And that's definitely something that's come up in a few interviews, that algorithms always assume best performance when, if you think about composers, though, they don't always have the same fluency of different styles, so they're not always going to make the optimal decision. So like if you're going to try and use a Dijkstra algorithm, sometimes you want to take you know, not the shortest path necessarily, because creativity isn't always about optimization, is it? So I think that's an interesting thought you had there. So sort of building on it.
There are a lot of parallels, and bringing it back to narrative. You know, it's quite trendy at the moment to do voice generation, emotional voice generation. You know, it's Carol knows probably lots about. You know, I've kind of always remained skeptical. You know, I had a lot of demonstrations, and it can work functionally. So, you know, basically, it was work before Google, but you know, Google's AI work kind of triggered this whole flow of voice generation, and it can work in short snippets as well. You know, you can kind of trick the brain a little bit, but after a while, you pretty quickly pick up on that kind of it's not quite feeling right. It's not even about the audio quality. It's just not kind of chiming right. You know, it's the uncanny valley equivalent of voice. And I think that happy accident is, you know, we'll talk about musicians, but that's what actors do as well, isn't it? It's kind of like just throwing something in, or trying that, or taking it to slightly unexpected ways, you know. And that's kind of almost where, you know, we're not there for voice for sure. It'd be amazing to think we could get there at some point, but maybe not. You know, maybe there is a barrier there, and that's you know, a question for Kyle really. You know, but maybe there's that threshold and we can't quite get over that threshold in music or voice generation, whatever it is, just to convince us enough beyond anything that's functional, or functional plus, you know, better than functional, which works in some contexts, but maybe not in a very narrative heavy context.
Yeah, that's a big question with lots of moving parts, isn't it? I don't know, there is definitely something sort of human in, well, voice performance very specifically, and also in musical performance, isn't there? And I don't know if I'm qualified to answer that question really. There's a lot of arguments for not being able to recreate that human aspect of certain things though. And, you know, we've spent more than thousands of years evolving to communicate using specific frequencies. And there's probably things that aren't modeled or modelable, but I'm not really sure, sorry. It's
a good question. Sorry, I didn't intend to stump you, you know, but it's an interesting thought, isn't it? That you know, maybe there is this barrier, or maybe it's just a question of time. Maybe it's just we need better technology, you know. And I have clients asking me about, well, can't we just voice generate a script? I'm like, not really. I mean, you know, we do it on some projects where the expressiveness doesn't matter so much. We just need a convincing narration. Fine, you know, if it's like, you know, a tutorial or something. It's a really fascinating question where I've, you know, worked so far, I've tended basically to say, let composers compose. You know, they know how to do it, like, but just provide more tools for them to do more things with it, or, you know, to apply it in a better way in the game, whatever that means.
Can I just, on that note about the tools, I've been wondering, Paul, you especially mentioned that there are tools that you design for clients. And I can understand why they wouldn't just release it as something accessible to everyone. But why is there a lack of accessible tools similar to what Kyle is working on? I'm sure he's not the first person to think that tools could be in existence that you could use as a composer and sort of co-create with the system. So I remember ages ago, I think it was during my master's, I was actually interested in procedural audio and generative music as well. And then when you Google it and then you read the papers, they always say, oh yes, we did this system, but they never tell you what it is. And there's no way to find it. So there's never a link. Here's the system, use it. No, the paper is written, you understand pretty much how it's done, but then no system available. Why? Is it about money? Is it about copyright issue? What is it about?
Kyle's posted that link, and it's true. So there are VST plugins which do some of this. Like I mentioned Nautical, and Current Forerunner. I mean, there are tools that do it. I mean, essentially, it's not that hard, and that's almost part of a problem. You could sit down. I mean, and you've got Max as well, and Pure Data, and obviously all that side of things, and libpd. On the game side, generally speaking, not always. There's a certain way of coding, usually C++, but not always. Whatever, C#. And so you're dealing with slightly different technical issues where it has to be cross-platform sometimes or not, like issues we've had. But essentially, like the tools are kind of there. Like they kind of are. If you sat down a program, like even for a day, I want a simple rule-based system, just to kind of do this. They'll do it. It's not complicated. So I think the idea that all we need is a kind of really good tool and it'll save all the problems, that's not the problem. I just don't think it is. Besides which, I think there's all kind of commercial reasons why, would you produce a tool as an audience, but it's not that complicated to do, so why would we even bother? I think it's more that, maybe someone comes out with something for WYs, but actually WYs already has its interactive music system, like it's there. Like, so why not use that? Or if you're using Unity, it's not hard to create a Unity script. Like what we did at Campfire, it's a super simple script. Like we could probably release that, but there's really nothing in it. It's like, play this, wait, look at this value, that's why I think even approaching on a per project basis, that's not the problem. Like the problem is a project a good match for it? Are the devs willing to do it? And do you have a skill set to do it? Don't worry about the tech. Like the tech is a resolvable problem.
So in short, the advice is for the non-technical or less technical composers, find a good programmer.
Yes.
Bribe them.
Yeah.
Always find a good programmer, make them your best friend. That is the solution to all your problems, always. Yes.
I think Tamiya's question might have been related to the fact that a lot of game design has now actually opened up to non-coders. So you have programs that sort of do the coding for you. And that's not really been the case for the audio design part of it, as I understand it. So why hasn't this happened for audio? I think, Tamiya, wasn't that the point of the question?
No, but it's actually a good point.
Well, I mean, if somebody like amateur like myself, I could probably without any coding skills, come up or design a fairly simple game. But could I do the audio for it? Probably not a procedural audio in any case. I would have to ask friends who are apt at coding.
That is a good point. Especially if it's a one-member team. Like there are a lot of solo devs lately. Although I'm assuming the solo devs are usually more adept in programming, but these days there are some tools that make it fairly easy to make a game. And I think in these cases, the audio is even more overlooked than in bigger cases, maybe.
Yeah, and I think one thing that it would do is maybe, first of all, make people more aware that audio is a big part, but also when you open something up to the private user. So the problem that we earlier discussed, that maybe audio is either added on later or not really integrated in the design. When you provide tools for one single person or a small team to all know about this in equal terms, then this process becomes more integrated, I suppose.
But Susanne, I think you nailed. Yeah, just a very quick thing. You nailed that before when you said like audio is still an afterthought. I think it all boils down to that, and it just branches out in various things, like Paul was saying, that we already have the tech, but it's just what I was saying, that we need just a mental shift to understand the real magnitude of audio. But I think it really boils down to, and I think we're getting there, by the way, even in stories like in games. Like I recently played Death Stranding, and that's a story on a game that I can say, oh, okay, this could be a really, really good movie. Because for me, games and stories and games were like always B serious stuff when they were like really solid and good. But if you compare the quality and the depth of a storytelling in a game compared to a movie, For me, I mean, I don't play many games, so I'm not really a good example. But when I played Death Stranding, I thought like, okay, we stepped up here big time. I don't know if you guys have played that, but just story-wise, there's a lot of depth and a lot of symbolism and a lot of things you could. Yeah, there's just a lot, and that's probably the deepest game in any story that I've ever played. I don't know if you have any other heavily story-based game to suggest to me. That would be cool because I would like to know more.
I've got 2 suggestions for you. I don't know if you're on PlayStation or Xbox or PC, but Uncharted 4 has a procedural music system, and that's very narrative heavy.
Procedural music. Sorry to interrupt you. I played it. That was the other game where the story is like kind of a bit more basic, but how does it? What kind of procedural audio it has? Because I played it twice because that's how much I liked it.
Sorry. When I say procedural, I'm using it sort of in the. I should probably have said generative. It has a generative music system in the sense of like recombining music assets in real time for variation.
Right.
And it's also doing sampling in real time. There's a video on YouTube from Full Sail University, and the person who was in charge of the audio team does a big talk about like the music integration and the implementation and stuff. I can find the link for you if you want.
Yeah, that'd be great.
And another less narrative heavy but has a cool procedural music system is The Rise of the Tomb Raider.
See,
which
yeah, but I mean story wise, like yeah, I would love to play more narrative games, but have a story that it's kind of worth to be explored, like Death Stranding, for instance. Uncharted 4 was like really good. I played it twice because I really liked the atmosphere was so well done. But the story was kind of beautifully written. Yeah, sorry, I didn't explain myself clearly now.
The Artful Escape. I recommend that one. It's a recent game. And it's actually made by a musical band. They were musicians. I actually forgot what their name was, but yeah, that's a recent, I think, really well done game. And music is a big part of. I don't know if it's procedural or not, but there are some mechanics in the game where you need to shred the guitar through the whole game essentially. But it's a very good story as well. What else? The Last Campfire. I recommend you that one. I think it has a good story. I mean, Mutazione you already played. There are quite a few good ones.
Oh, we can't hear you.
Yeah, sorry, I was saying if you want to play it,
Paul, you could push all your games here.
Yeah, I don't push. I'll give you a code. It's fine. I can give you a code if you want to play Last Campfire. It's fine. I don't want to talk about my own games, but Campfire was interesting because it's interesting. You think it's got a good story or a strong narrative, because like the narrative really emerged from the game, not kind of the other way around. So we kind of, I've not worked this way before because we're such a small team. I think we re-recorded the entire script about 15 times. And just every time we were like, oh, we'll do a bit more of this, or we'll do a bit more of that, or bring in this element. But it probably is the only game I've worked on where I got to the end and I actually felt a little bit, tearful, almost like in my own bloody game. Like I was like, oh, it kind of works really nicely when you play the whole thing together. But that was unusual and very, very iterative. I think we could only do that because we were such a small team. And the voice actor as well was just working from home during COVID, and she was great. And we just kept saying, oh, tomorrow, can we just do another hour or two of this? Or we just change this, Bigger titles, it's so hard to do that. You've got this lump of a script, thousands of pages, and you can't be iterative. It has to be like 100% done before you go into the studio.
Well, thousands of pages for the Last Campfire.
No, Campfire. No, on a normal title.
On a normal title. Okay.
I mean, normal title scripts are just like
okay,
immense. No, not Campfire.
Also, Inkle Studios has a lot of, I think, good story in their games. maybe.
Which one? Yeah.
So I think it's called Inkle Studios.
Can you type that down, please?
Yes. They have a tool called Ink, which is a narrative design tool that you can use. Oh yeah, Firewatch, that's a good one. And I think they recently did also similarly a quite short game that they did in lockdown. They didn't even announce it, and then surprisingly released it. And it's a game where you have to kill your husband and get away with the murder. And it's all done through narrative. I actually don't remember what the game is called, but I will send you a
okay.
If I remember it.
No, okay. Yes, please send.
Yes, so if nobody else wants to have a go, and the moderator shouldn't actually ask many questions, but I have a question. So I observed that there is a fine balance to be struck between very high control, actually, and letting go. So how do each of you approach that balance? And also maybe in that context, so I understand you mostly presented with more or less already colored in ideas for games. So the expectation is on the audio designer or writer to have the sensitivity, I suppose, to respond to that. And yeah, so these elements, interaction with the narrative, control, and then letting go. How do you approach this? Alessandro, maybe first.
I don't know. For me, it has been like really experience based or moments in the games, so different moments I had more control, and other moments I had less control. I had to let it go, because when you have to let it go, you have to let it go. There's no other choice, because otherwise it means that you have a bit more control. And of course, as a content creator, you want to kind of serve the game the best way possible by applying your sensibility, blah, blah, blah. Sometimes you can't. So for me, I don't know, if I think about what happened in the past 8 years when I worked on that game, it's just really a balance. And again, it was easy to let it go because you knew you had no control. For instance, like in that big moment, or even in another moment, can't really spoil them, but after that, there's another moment where I had to really let things go and just do, for instance, like very simple things. But I don't know if that answers your question, but yeah, it's a dance between the two, as always in game development. It's a dance between two poles that are opposite. Pretty much what happens in life here.
Yeah, I suppose I meant also when you're first faced with the job, how do you first try and play whatever is available of that game already, and how do you prepare or start off your work? Maybe Paul.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. If you were gonna comment.
No. It's just really I wouldn't know how to put that into a. It's really a fluid thing for me. Of course, at the very beginning, you try to have as much control as possible, but then you will find out that there are like a lot of dead ends, and that kind of becomes easy to let it go because you won't have control over that. Yeah, I don't know. Probably it's that simple for me, really. I don't know. I don't know if that answers your question. Maybe not, but Paul.
No, I think it's a perfect answer. I'm not sure I can contribute more. I think it's you want to push it as much as you can when you can, and there are absolutely times when you don't and deliberately don't. And I'm a really big fan of whatever we call it, having randomized systems, combined with very linear traditional systems. And I think dramatically and narratively that works really well. But every project has its own identity, its own challenges. So And there are many games where I just won't even suggest any kind of procedural system. It's just not suitable. So you can't be too kind of fixed on any of this. I think it's a tool in the toolbox which has amazing value in specific situations and should be pushed a bit more.
Okay, thanks. Anybody else? Timea, you were silent, slightly silent the last couple of minutes. Do you have anything else to ask? No.
Oh my God.
Kyle?
Sorry, I thought I'd unmuted my mic, but it's interesting, really, like, because a lot of the systems that we have discussed are the kind of thing where you have to compose the music with the design of the system in mind, because you're going to be, sort of transforming it by recombining things. But I don't know, there are some tools which can help you get into that mindset, I guess, in more of just a composing session. Like we've thrown a few out earlier. There's that Insta Composer, which seems to just be trying to bring music generation into the DAW. And I suppose you can try things like that, and you can try the task that Paul said earlier of taking sounds that have like a tonal center of a certain key, throwing stuff into Ys and getting started that way. I feel like I've deviated from the question though there, sorry. Can you just prompt me back towards what I'm supposed to be saying?
So sorry, no, I just wondered if you had further questions to the panel, but the original one was how do you strike the balance between control? So obviously the procedural audio that's supposed to play for the user later, you have to execute quite a high amount of control on those in order to make them do the random things that you then later on hoping to do. So.
All right, I misunderstood where we'd gone with that. But yeah, control's definitely a thing, especially for creatives, isn't it? Like, and I did wonder if, and maybe Alessandro and Paul or Timea can maybe highlight this a bit more, but in composers I've spoken to, some of them show kind of antagonistic opinions towards things that try and do creative tasks, and not all of them, but there are some, and I guess that's going to happen with all work where an AI is trying to do someone's job. But there is a very fine balance to be found there in control. Like, people don't want to give up too much control, because then it's like, is this my music or is it not? Is it representative of your music? What are people's thoughts on that? I guess that's a question to build on.
There's one question, as we're running out of time, maybe one last one from Peter. Peter, do you want to say that in person maybe, rather than me reading it out?
Yeah, so I'm sorry I couldn't see the start, so I didn't know whether this had been asked, but I'm really interested in the idea of creative tools that get out of the bloody way. Yeah, so I pick up a guitar and my guitar doesn't say, oh, well, on page 7 of the manual there's this thing, and if you know that. So I'm just interested, the tools that you've been talking about, I've only really heard about Insta Composer and one or two others. Are these tools which get out of the way of the creative process, or are these tools which are sort of programming tools which are not sort of creative tools in that sense?
I can probably go with that one, but
Yeah.
Thank you, Peter. I mean, to be honest, a lot of them are quite fiddly and, probably not terribly helpful. You tend to find you do get over that. Like once you're in control of the system, you kind of forget about that stuff. But the other approach is like, I don't want to take too long, but on No Man's Sky, we used to spend 65 days of static, right? We told them, write an album for the game. Okay, so that's exactly contrary. You may not be there at that time, but what I said earlier, which is like have a mindset that from the beginning you're doing it in a kind of different way, generative way. Because the composers, they like working in certain ways, and you want to disrupt that as little as possible, which is basically what you're saying. So we kept the tool or the tech out of the way, and then actually with them just said, all right, can we go back in the studio and those tracks you got, just make more variations, like those drums, let's just do some more drums. Like, and I built the tool in a way deliberately to then hoover up the way that they were working. So they didn't have to deal with the tech. Actually, they kind of did because they're very technical and they wrote me scripts and stuff, but essentially they didn't have to. And then from my side, it was like, actually it's minimum effort. So again, touching on what you're saying, like, are the tasks that can be simply done or automated rather than pushing sliders or importing and doing all this? Can you just go, here's a bunch of stuff, like do your thing on it, and then I'll come back and maybe more in like a mixing process, start to then play with it. Like, because the mixing process, we're used to sitting in front of a computer and playing the sliders and doing all that, you know, and that's quite a good way of thinking about it. Like minimum interference from composition, push it all, you know, to the other end, kind of, if you like, a mixing stage, but with the knowledge that the two are going to work really well together.
Okay, cool. So we actually pushed it almost to what I set as a time limit, 12:30, which was unexpected. So I think at this stage, Mike just asked, have we all seen Rocksmith Plus by Ubisoft? Have we? I'm not sure. People are shaking their head. No, okay. So I think we should, at this stage, thank all the panelists. I think it's been an amazing panel, quite insightful, even for non-audio people, in fact, non-technical and anything people like me. I hope the audience enjoyed it. We will release a recording of this in due course, about a week's time, I'm guessing. Our next seminar, I haven't actually found a date yet, but it's usually towards the end of each month. So I'm guessing something like 23rd or something of November. So hopefully we'll see you back then, all of you. And unless there are any more questions, I would just really like to thank all of you, Alessandro, Paul, Kyle, Timea, and see you soon. We'll all be, or some of us will be at the Develop Brighton, conference. So I don't know if any of you will be there too. So we might even meet in person. That would be lovely. Thank you.
Thank you, Susanne.
Thank you.
For having us.
Really
Bye.
Bye.
Dai. Ciao belli.
Bye.